Hey there, my name is Sam Fallon. Welcome to Lesson 5.4, Triage in the Science Sections. Here we're going to cover how to do the easier questions first, the harder questions later, and we'll talk about passages as well in regards to doing the easier passages first and the harder passages later to maximize the amount of time that you have to spend on the questions that need it on the test. We're going to go over 3 learning goals in order to learn how to best triage in the science sections on your MCAT. First of all, we'll talk about how to triage the passages, and we'll do some practice and quickly scanning and figuring out whether a passage is good to do now or good to do later. Next, we'll look at how to triage questions, how to look at a question and see should you do it now within the passage or possibly later within the passage. And then finally, we'll look at the idea of a pseudo-discrete question and when usually they're good to do right away, but every once in a while you might find a pseudo-discrete that's hard enough to actually put it all the way off to the end of the section itself. These learning goals will be covered in the context of science topics that you reviewed before class. First of all, the nervous system, and second, the endocrine system. Now let's cover learning goal 1, where we'll talk about how to recognize an easy passage versus ambiguous passage versus a difficult passage, and how to organize yourself and your thoughts on the MCAT to make sure that you're using your time most efficiently. So we call it section triage strategy because the way that you're going to go through your MCAT is similar to how you would go through an emergency type situation as a physician, how you would triage that situation. You would find the patients that are in the most need of your help and treat those patients first. On the MCAT, the parts of the test that are in most need of your help are the easier parts, the parts that'll get you potentially more points on the test, and those parts that you can do more quickly. So on the MCAT, you're going to actually tackle the discrete questions first. Anytime you're in a science section, you'd find all the discrete questions and answer them. Discrete questions, since you don't have to read a passage to answer them, tend to be quicker and easier to answer. Then, once you're done with all the discrete questions, you'll hit that review button on the test. You'll go to the list of all the questions, and then you'll click on the first question that's associated with the passage and go back to that question. And then you're going to jump through the passages, giving them just a brief look, and we'll show you how to do this later in the lesson. But you give them just a brief look, and you do the easiest passages first. Then you move on to the passages you're not quite sure how hard they're going to be. They're ambiguous in their difficulty. And then finally, once you're done with those passages, you do one last pass and catch all your hardest passages. Usually just 1 to 2 per section for these. Now some people may want to set up their scratch paper, something like this on the test, where you've used pluses and minuses to indicate harder or easier passages. In order to do this, you need to look through all the passages in the test first, make a quick decision on them as fast as you possibly can, write it down, and then come back and do the easier passages. Some people might want to use 1s, 2s, and 3s to show hard, medium, and easy passages, that kind of thing. So that's one way of doing it. In this case, you do have to spend a little bit of time up front on the test, deciding which passages are easy and deciding which passages are hard. Another way you could triage as well is once you're done with your discrete questions, just start at passage number 1. If you think it's easy, do it right then, and then move on. If you think it's hard, skip it and come back to it later. Basically, you'd make a first pass, potentially a second pass of all the passages once you go do your easy ones, and then a third pass to catch all the hardest passages. In this case, you wouldn't make the scratch work. You would just be automatically doing the passages, easy ones as you see them, harder ones you come back for later. So those are some ways you can set up your scratch paper in order to triage. If you want a smaller method, you could also just set up a simple tally of how many passages you finished in your scratch work, just say in the upper right-hand corner of your scratch paper, so you can keep track of how many passages you've done so far. The main takeaway here is exemplified in this Kaplan tip. Your triaging method should be your own style. It should be something that worked for you, and in order to figure that out, you're going to have to practice triaging. What we want to make sure that you know, after looking at this screen, is that you need a triaging method to begin with. You can't just go through the test, do it all in order, and expect that you're going to be using your time efficiently and effectively. Rather, come up with a triaging strategy that works for you, that's individualized for your personal MCAT experience, and you'll be good to go to use your time more efficiently on the test. Speaking of getting practice triaging, let's go ahead and look at 3 passages and practice triaging them in an effective and efficient way. First of all, when you're looking at these pages in your book, you might notice that some of the text is gray and some of the text is black. This is like this to demonstrate what it would look like when you're triaging on the test. The black text is what you would read carefully. The gray text is what you would not even really glance at all, so you can properly see which parts of the passage are important for triaging and which aren't. You can see very little is important for triaging. You're not supposed to spend very much time at all triaging the passages. Notice that there's also questions and figures on the page. This is because these are things that you're supposed to look at briefly when you're doing your triaging step. The figures are supposed to be glanced at, and you determine if they're difficult or easy figures. And then the questions, you just really quickly look at them to determine length and if there's a lot of math or if it's more analysis. Note that this brief look at the questions is not actually the question triaging strategy. That's something that you do when you're ready to start looking at the questions, which is what we'll talk about in later learning goals in this lesson. But during the step where you're doing passage triage, you do just glance at the questions very briefly to see how difficult they're going to make doing that whole passage. So let's take a look at this first passage. We see that there's a couple of long paragraphs that's about diseases like the Lambert-Eaton syndrome here, and it's also about the nervous system. That's a topic here. If you look at the figure, you can see that it's kind of complicated. There's a lot of graphs going on, they're labeled. It's the type of figure that you're going to have to use the passage to analyze to see what's going on in that figure. Finally, we have a couple of questions. The first question we can see is fairly long, especially in the answer choices. And in the second question, we know we have to go back to the passage to look up information on that Lambert-Eaton syndrome. The triage decision that you would make on this passage depends on a couple of things, therefore, your comfort with the topic and your comfort with answering questions like this and going through more difficult graphs. Therefore, a lot of people would rate this passage at least ambiguous difficulty, potentially hard difficulty, and a passage is best left for later. What you should do, however, is write your own triage decision down in your books and justify it. Why did you pick to do it now or to do it later? Let's try out a second passage. We can see that this passage has no graphs, figures, tables, or equations. It's just text. This can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. If you have to get all of your information from the text, that could be hard. It's a little tricky to tell. We do see that the topic is probably the endocrine system. We've got something about the pituitary adenomas and prolactin. Moving over into the questions, we see a little bit longer than normal questions, but the answer choices aren't quite as long. Again, this passage is most likely rated at ambiguous difficulty. If you're very comfortable with the endocrine system, you might choose to do it earlier. If you're not so comfortable with figures, tables, graphs, and equations, you might appreciate that this passage doesn't have those and you could rate it as an easier passage. This one's really up to you. It's an ambiguous difficulty type of passage. Again, write your own triage decision down in your book and make sure that you write down your justifications as well. So you're starting to realize and starting to understand why you would skip a passage for later or why you might try to do a passage right away. Let's look at one more passage. We see that in this passage we got the nervous system as our topic, so that could be a topic that you like or maybe not. We also see that the paragraphs are slightly shorter than they were in the other two examples. And finally, we see a figure down at the bottom that's going to be a slightly easier figure to analyze. It's straightforward, it's pictures of neurons, which you've seen before. So then you look to the questions. Question number 5 is pretty short. Question number 6 is a bit longer. So the things that would go into our triage decision would be the diagram being straightforward, these shorter paragraphs, and the fact that there is one short question. We could make an overall triage decision that this is probably a passage we could do right now. Again, make sure you're writing down in your book what you would do with this passage and your justifications for doing so. Now let's get some triaging practice. We decided that this passage, the one with the snail and the neuron diagram, was an easier passage. So we're going to take a look at this passage in the next learning goal. Just as though we were on the real MCAT, we found an easy passage and we decided this one is going to be easy to do. We're going to go ahead and do it right now. In the next learning goal, we'll actually cover this passage in the context of question triage. Now let's cover learning goal 2 of lesson 5.4. Here we're going to talk about not how to triage whole passages, but how to triage the questions within those passages. The nice thing about triaging questions is if you do the easier questions first, one, you're making sure that you get those easier points out of the way first, so you can have more time to work on the harder questions. But two, as you do the easy questions, you'll have to go back to the passage a couple of times, you'll have to use some critical thought about the passage. You get more comfortable with looking into the passage, you get more used to it. And therefore, by the time you get into these medium difficulty to harder difficulty questions, you'll be more primed with the passage to answer them, and you're increasing your chances of getting those medium difficulty or harder difficulty questions correct. This all leads to more points on test day, which is a very good thing. We're going to go through the passage from learning goal 1 that we decided was easier and go through the questions for that passage. So let's actually go ahead and read this passage. Take 2 or 3 minutes, read through it, and make your own passage outline. Let's look at paragraph 1. It looks like we have some kind of snail here, and we're basically poking the snail to see what happens. When the snail's siphon is touched, it looks like the snail uses motor neurons, and the gill ends up withdrawing. However, we get a change keyword here. If you continue to poke this poor snail, repeated touching of the siphon, Eventually, the animal becomes habituated to the stimulus. That's a word we haven't heard yet, so we'll see the passage to find that. And it looks like what habituated means is the snail no longer withdraws its gill in response. So if you poke the snail enough times, it doesn't withdraw its gill anymore. Then after poking this poor snail, we have electric shock to resensitize the snail. And after that, it will once again withdraw its gill in response to being poked. So poke the snail first, eventually the snail stops withdrawing its gill, shock the poor snail, and then the snail will withdraw its gill again. There's more information about resensitization that it can last for days, and it's a form of short-term memory. An outline that you could make for this paragraph is that the snail gets habituated to touch, and then shock is what we use to resensitize this poor snail. Moving on to the second paragraph, we get more information about habituation. It looks like its cause is a reduction in the amount of neurotransmitter released by the sensory neurons. This leads to a decrease in the postsynaptic potential and therefore decrease in those contraction of the gill muscles. So less neurotransmitter means less withdrawing the gill muscles. We're then given a figure of the sea snail's nerve system. So your outline for paragraph 2 could be something along the lines of habituation comes from less neurotransmitters, and that the figure is of the nerve system of this snail. Finally, we get to the third paragraph, and we see sensitization come up again. It's when we shock the snail to get the snail to withdraw its gill again, and it looks like we're getting more information about it. It looks like sensitization activates these nociceptors, which respond to pain. So yes, the poor snail is experiencing pain. And we get even more information about what happens with these neurons. They synapse onto the presynaptic axon terminal of that siphon. And then we finally get that reference to figure 1, so we know that paragraph 3 is associated with figure 1. It looks like serotonin release is what causes this cell to begin the resensitization process. Cyclic AMP is released within the cell. It phosphorylates voltage-gated potassium channels, and then they remain shut. This should activate some prior knowledge for you. We remember that voltage-gated channels are what has to open to allow repolarization to occur in a neuron. So if you have just gone through depolarization and the action potential has happened, after that the neuron has to recover from the action potential and repolarization. So basically sensitization is stopping this repolarization process, or at least making it happen at a later time. So it makes sense that potassium couldn't flow out of the cell during resensitization, and therefore voltage-gated calcium channels remain open longer, and that means that more calcium can flow into the cell. We remember that calcium is directly related with the release of neurotransmitter, so more calcium equals a larger release of neurotransmitter, and that's how we get this gill to respond again after habituation. For your outline, you can put something like the shock sensitization process. The Kaplan tip at the bottom of the page reminds us that we don't have to take the test in order. Remember, you're taking the MCAT. The MCAT isn't taking you. So you can do the test in any order of the passages, and you can do those questions in any order within each passage that you want. So make sure that you begin to use this triaging strategy so you can both take the passages and the questions in the order that's most efficient for you. Notice that there's space in your book to write down whether or not you would choose to do this question now or later. I'll show you the process of making some of these question triaging decisions, but make sure you also write down your own decision about triaging that specific question. In fact, go ahead and take about a minute or so right now, look at each of the 4 questions, and make your own triage decision, and then write that decision in your book. So taking a look at question number 1, while it's not a terribly long question, it does require going back to the passage and digesting some information in order to answer it, so it's probably something that we should do later just because it's not that hard, but we do want to go back to the passage and look stuff up, which is going to take time. This is an example of a question that you might want to do later. Make sure you write down your own decision in your book. So let's go ahead and do this question later and take a look at question number 2. In question number 2, the researcher gently brushes the snail, and then the researcher presses the siphon more forcefully. The answer choices are just about the nervous system. It actually doesn't require going back to the passage. This is a good question to do now because it's based on information that you already know, and you don't have to go back to the passage. This is an easy question that you can do now. So make sure you write down your own triage decision in your book. But taking a look at this question, the snail is experiencing a stronger stimulus when the researcher presses the siphon more forcefully, and so you have to remember what you know about stronger stimuli. Go ahead and put in your answer. The correct answer here is that more frequent action potentials go to that muscle neuron. The way that your body receives sensory information and outputs muscle and motor information is through amount of action potentials, not magnitude of action potentials. The concept that's being tested here is that more frequent action potentials are how the body represents a stronger stimulus, not larger action potentials or action potentials in places that we don't usually see them. Let's move on to number 3. This one, right off the bat, we can see has longer answer choices, and it's the kind of question where we're going to have to go back to the passage to understand more about habituation. Again, while you should be writing down your own triage decision in your book, this is an example of a harder question that you might want to do later because of that length and the fact that it requires analysis. So then let's move on to number 4. On this one, we see that's a shorter question, and all we have to do is glance back at that easier figure from the passage. So this is an example of an easier question, something that you should do now because it's easier to find that information from the passage. Let's take a look actually at the picture from the passage, and we're trying to figure out which of these numbered lines in the image is an axon. We know the axon would have to come after the neuronal cell body, and so line 1 and line 2 work for us, as well as 4. The third line actually comes before the neuronal cell body, and so that one's going to be a dendrite and it's not going to work for our answer. So we're looking for an answer that says 1, 2, and 4. Answer choice D works perfectly for us. So we triaged these 4 questions, we found 2 easy questions to do, and then we had 2 harder questions that we're going to leave for later. Let's go ahead and do those harder questions now. Number 1, we remember, was going to require us to go back to the passage and look up some information, so let's do that now. In the question, we wanted to know what's true regarding membrane potential of the siphon axon following sensitization. Sensitization, you probably remember, is in the 3rd paragraph, and your answer choices are about polarization. So we need to go back to the 3rd paragraph and look for something that has to do with polarization in the 3rd paragraph. We remember that we got this part about what cyclic AMP does during the sensitization process. We were phosphorylating those voltage-gated potassium channels, and then they remained shut. Therefore, when action potentials arrive, the potassium channels do not open, and the potassium can't flow out of the cell. We remember potassium's in the cell when the neuron is depolarized, and the way that the cell would repolarize is to get that potassium out. However, if this sensitization process has happened, the potassium's still in there, and we're kind of just stuck, at least for a while, in the state of depolarization. So we're looking for an answer choice that says that. Now, answer choice B does say something about depolarization. However, if B is going to be correct, then it just means that the axon terminal is depolarized all the time, even after sensitization, which is definitely not true. So we need to look for a different answer. And we see that actually answer choice D also says something about depolarization and adds in that extra part about time. Answer choice D, therefore, is going to be our answer because it touches on all of the aspects of what goes on in the sensitization process, that voltage-gated calcium channels do cause a neuron to stay depolarized, but that they stay just depolarized for longer. We know that at some point repolarization does happen because the snail can continue to withdraw its gill, meaning that repolarization is eventually happening. We also skipped question number 3, so let's go back and do it now. Remember, this question was the longer one, and we were looking for an explanation of habituation. Now, in habituation areas in the passage, paragraphs 1 and 2, there's not actually an explanation of how it works. However, we know that sensitization is the process that reverses habituation. So whatever sensitization does must be the cure for the problem that habituation causes. In other words, we're looking for the opposite of sensitization to explain habituation. So let's go back and see how sensitization works. Voltage-gated calcium channels stay open longer, allowing more calcium to flow into the cell, and then we remembered that was able to allow that increased neurotransmitter release. So we're basically looking for something that says the opposite of this. The voltage-gated calcium channels may be shut too early because that's the opposite of remaining open longer, that we're not getting quite as much calcium because in sensitization we get more calcium. So looking through the answer choices, pick the one that's the opposite of sensitization. And the correct answer here is A. Repeated stimulation, which can end up causing habituation, leads to closing of calcium channels in the terminal membrane. That would get us less calcium and therefore works as the answer for the opposite of sensitization. So question triage. It means doing the easier questions first and also getting more comfortable with the passage as you do those easier questions. So when you have the time to spend on the harder questions, you're not only going to have used your time efficiently, but you're also going to be more comfortable with the passage and more ready to handle those more difficult questions. In that learning goal, you'll see a special type of question associated with the passage that's really more of a standalone question. It's called a pseudo-discrete. We're going to talk about a special type of MCAT question, a pseudo-discrete question. Now, these questions are special because they are within a passage and they're associated in topic with that passage. However, you don't need the passage to answer them. They are standalone in that you don't need any information directly out of the passage to be able to answer them. Because you don't need to analyze the passage to answer these questions, they tend to be easier. And so this learning goal is in particular going to focus on how to triage pseudodiscrete questions. Almost always the answer will be do them right away because they're easier. However, we will see a case in which a pseudodiscrete question has a bunch of math in it, and in this case, it's not only good to leave the pseudodiscrete question for later, but all the way to the end of this section, because that math can take up a lot of time. We're going to continue covering that passage about snail, habituation, and sensitization, and do some more questions associated with that passage in order to accomplish this learning goal. So for questions 5, 6, and 7 on this page, you can see that you again have prompts on the side of the lesson book pages that you would use to decide whether to do the question now or later. You also have an extra prompt there about information from the passage so that we can determine which of these questions are pseudodiscretes. Let's start off with number 5. In number 5, we see that we've got some numbers in the answer choices, and then we're talking about sensitization. So this question is related in topic to the passage, and it's going to require a little bit of thinking. However, once we realize that the question also says that potassium ions are unable to leave the cell, we realize that this question is actually just asking us about a neuron that's been depolarized. And then we're looking at millivolts of that depolarized neuron. This is actually information that you know already. Despite the word sensitization being in this question, you don't actually have to go back to the passage to research it in order to answer the question. Therefore, we need almost no information from the passage, just the fact that we've heard sensitization before. It's about all we really have to know. So therefore, this is a pseudodiscrete question, and it's a question that you should do now because it tends to be easier. It's information that you probably know already. So what is the millivoltage on a neuron that's been depolarized? And the correct answer is D, plus 35 millivolts. This is the voltage of a neuron that's been depolarized. And we have our answer. That's what a pseudodiscrete looks like. Let's take a look at number 6. In this one, we see the answer choices have a lot of numbers in them. There's in scientific notation. It looks like this is going to be a tricky math question. However, a quick glance through the question itself sees that we're not talking about the passage. We're just talking about a researcher working with serotonin. So this question is very vaguely related to the passage because serotonin also comes up in the passage, but the rest of it is just a math problem. So this is a pseudodiscrete question. No information is needed from the passage to answer this question. However, most people would correctly want to do this question later. Despite it being a pseudodiscrete, it's got a bunch of math, and you're going to need time at the end of the test that you've saved doing shorter questions to answer this one properly. The Kaplan tip at the bottom of this page reiterates this point. Don't waste your time doing these questions with long calculations. Save those for the end of the test when you've already gotten your easy points out of the way. Now there is one small caveat here. If you absolutely love doing unit conversion problems and you notice that this one is a unit conversion and say you have a 100% perfect method that you developed in your chemistry class, this is a problem you could do when you see it on test day, but that's only because it's easy for you. So make sure you're making these decisions based on how they work for you. So we'll skip this question for now and move over to question 7. Now question 7 has got a longer question stem, and we're going to have to go back to the passage in order to figure out how to answer it because there's some details about the snail and the shock treatment. So this is an example of something that needs information about habituation and resensitization from the passage, and therefore it is not a pseudodiscrete. It's something that we should do later after we've done our pseudodiscretes and our easier questions. However, it does happen to be the last question in the set, so it's something that we're going to have to do now. But on test day, it's something that you would skip at least until you're ready to do these harder questions. So let's take a look at the question. It looks like there's anesthetics that block voltage-gated sodium channels, and that they work well in sensory neurons because they block the transmission of pain. So we have to start thinking, where in the passage do we hear about pain? Then the question goes on to say that if we applied an anesthetic like this to the snail, followed by electric shock, they want to know the response. So note that the snail is going to get habituated first, then given the anesthetic, then resensitized using electric shock. Then we don't want to go back to the passage and find information about pain and see how that would relate to this question. We see this in the beginning of the third paragraph. It says that the electric shock stimulates these nociceptors, And those are the things that respond to the pain stimuli. That's what you're looking for. These neurons synapse on the axon terminal and release serotonin. That serotonin release is what we eventually use to get the cyclic AMP release. And we remember from the passage that the cyclic AMP release is what caused the rest of the process of sensitization. So basically, we need the electric shock to stimulate the pain receptors in order for serotonin to be released. Going back to the question, we see that we're blocking the transmission of pain with this anesthetic. So if we block the transmission of pain, we're blocking the ability of the nociceptors to do their job. If the nociceptors aren't doing their job, the cyclic AMP is never released and the sensitization process couldn't happen. Therefore, we're looking for an answer choice that says the sensitization process wouldn't work if we're using this anesthetic. Correct answer here is A. It fits our criteria of the sensitization process not working because it says the gill muscle would not become resensitized, and it gives us a reason for serotonin not being released. Now, let's go back to question 6, that math question we skipped, now that we've finished all the easy and even the hard questions in this question set. Number 6 would be a question that you want to do at the end of the section, and there's some math going on here. We've got 0.223 microliters of serotonin being released over 20 seconds. We want to know if that rate continues, how much serotonin are we able to produce in 1 hour. So it's really just a conversion problem, but conversion problems, while they tend to have easier math, do still take time, and that's why you want to leave these types of problems for the end of the section. So let's take a look at the math now. We want to set it up so that all our units will cancel out, and we eventually get the units that we see in the answer choices, which is milliliters per hour. So we can set this problem up like this. In this way, our units will cancel out. Microliters are going to cancel out, seconds will cancel out, and we're left with milliliters per hour. We also need to work with some of the math. When we have zeros on the top and the bottom of a problem like this, we can cancel them out. There's 2 zeros in the denominator, we can cancel out with these 2 zeros in the numerator. We can also cancel out this 2 from the 20, turn that into a 1, and take half of the 36 and turn that into an 18. Doing all that, we can simplify this down to this number. So we can see we've got a 100 in the bottom, and we've got 0.223 times 18 on the top, which is a little bit tricky. You can kind of maybe think of that as about 1/5 times 18, or 0.2 times 18, which is going to be around 4. So that can simplify into about 4 over 100, or 0.004. We look for that in our answer choices. We see that 4 times 10 to the negative 2, or answer choice B, works for us. Again, this math, while straightforward enough, definitely took us some time, and so it's something you should do only at the end of the section if you've got extra time remaining, knowing that you've answered most of the questions already. Let's review what we covered in this lesson. For triaging a section, you do your discrete questions first, then you move into the passages. For each of the passages, you want to do the easier passages first and move into the harder ones. To figure out which one's easy and which one is hard, you look at the difficulty of the topic, the sentence structure and the vocabulary, and also whether there's those figures, tables, graphs, and equations. Finally, you look at the questions, do a really quick scan of them, and see how easy they look in length and needing to analyze the passage. Once you've done all that, you're able to look at the easier passages first, those passages with ambiguous difficulty, and then finally the harder passages. There's a summary chart on your page that you can use for studying later. It covers the difference between these harder and easier types of questions. So your easier questions are shorter, don't require the passage as much, have a clear way to answer them during the plan step, and require no calculations, and usually are testing skill 1. Characteristics of harder questions are longer. They do have heavy passage research required. The way to the answer is not always that clear. The question can require calculations, and often the question is testing skill 2. Great work on completing this lesson about triaging in the science sections. Make sure you practice this triaging strategy and find a way to make it individualized and personalized to you to make sure that you are getting through the passage in the most efficient way that works for you. Keep up the great practice.